What I want to talk about today is this question of the Constitution and take up some of the things that LaRouche has been taking up in these latest few papers. And I'll go through this, but the reality is, one of the reasons that the country is at the point of going out of existence, and we're at the point of World War III, is that 99% of the American people don't have a clue of what the United States federal government constitutional system is. This is somewhat of an irony because, for those of us that engage in organizing and talking to a lot of people, you run into good people, right, all the time. People that are supporters of ours who say, "Yeah, I'm for the Constitution. I'm a constitutionalist," right? And they're very passionate about it, and that's appropriate. Now, what do you think they mean? What's going on in their mind when they say that? What do you think they mean about what the Constitution is?
The Bill of Rights.
Did I pay you beforehand? No. Anyway, I mean, that's absolutely right. People think of, or maybe one, not all of them. Maybe they think of, I'm a Second Amendment guy. We got to go back to the Constitution. Now, I'll say something quite sharp on this and perhaps controversial, I don't know. The Bill of Rights is completely extraneous to the constitutional system. Both Hamilton, Washington, and we'll look at this a little bit later, were opposed, and Madison originally also, to any idea, because this would detract from the force of what the actual constitutional system was. So you can just keep that in your mind, right? It is an interesting thing. Because that's not what the constitutional system is. I mean, look at it. The irony, of course, with that today is the nation's being destroyed, people don't have water, we're about to starve to death, right? And all these people saying, yeah, but I will, and people will put their lives on the line to fight for what they think is the Constitution, whether these rights. They will. They'll sit there, whether they go in the military and they think that that's what they're defending the country for, right? Well, if that's true, then why are we about to go out of existence, number one? And number two, all these amendments are being totally violated. Second Amendment, First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, forget about it. So there's obviously a problem here in terms of a complete misunderstanding. Now, this is my favorite example of one of them. This is my congressman, Congressman Scott Garrett. Scott Garrett is a champion of the Constitution. This is what he's known as. He's a Republican from northern New Jersey. This is from his own website. He's the founder and the chairman of the Congressional Constitutional Caucus, a coalition that seeks to educate members of Congress and the public about the original intent of the Founding Fathers. Wow. Now, of course, if you look at it, this is actually from an expose that was just done about a week ago on who are the top whores of the banks in the Congress. That is, which members of Congress do the banks of the big banks, Citicorp, Morgan Stanley, sure not Morgan Stanley, Chase, etc., have control over in terms of the money that they give them. And he's like way up on the top of the list. So we should call him Congressman Scott Garrett, Republican Citicorp, right? Because he doesn't represent New Jersey, he represents Citicorp. That's his biggest donor. That shows you the money, etc. So this guy's done everything his entire career to destroy the protection of the American people from these banksters, these bastards that are raping the country. But he's for the Constitution. So you got to ask yourself how that, and also think of the people that vote for this. So there's something obviously real wrong here. Now, what I want to do, I don't have to look at that for a moment, is just take a little section from one of the LaRouche's latest papers, which is in that latest EIR that we have here, which is called The Return to the Actual U.S. Constitution, where he takes this up. And here's what he says, in part. I shall demonstrate with successive examples in the course of this present report that implicit intention for the benefit of all mankind was already implicit in the U.S. economic practice as typified by the principles of Hamilton. Any contrary view of a standard of practice has been, in fact, the promise of a relative disaster for our republic and for those of many other nations by comparison. The essential fraud The hokum, widely practiced by the half-witting or less, is the prevalent practice of confusion used to confuse current custom with the present lack of proper conception of a principle of a coherent body of both formal and scientific universal law. The folly is located in either simply mental incompetence or by the division of law into categories. Categories which divide notions of law into a collection of effectively incoherent sets of impulsively set law-making practices, which share no actually inherent systemic coherence with one another. In the case of the United States, in particular, that quality of general irrationalism in the practice of law has been notably a particular foolishness in our nation's practice of law, a foolishness which was set into motion early on by the fraudulent and also widespread corruption of the reading of our intention of our actual federal Constitution, as has been done by the subversion of the federal Constitution, as done through the specific agency of corruption expressed by the agency of the moral corruption known as states' rights. From the close of the second presidency of George Washington until the corrections introduced by Presidents Monroe and John Quincy Adams against states' rights, the British Empire and its international banking system had, with relatively rare exceptions, usually dominated the fate of the citizenry of the United States. Otherwise, exceptionally good presidents like Lincoln, McKinley, FDR, John F. Kennedy have been outstanding as notably successful exceptions to the general trend of moral decadence which has dominated our U.S. economy, the opinion of our schools, universities, related institutions, etc. The inherently corrupting force of international monetarism has been the chief mechanism by means of which this virtual cancerous presumption is spread internationally, as among us here too. The notion which must be placed foremost on this account, instead, is one aptly defined as the relative productive powers of labor of the human species' performance. When these are measured in terms of effectively relative rates of productivity per capita, and when relative value is measured in no other choice of terms than as actualized and realized energy flux density in all in the nature of relative historical action. That's quite a sentence there, but we'll just look at this. On this account, the assassination of U.S. Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton was in fact not only an expression of efforts to destroy the sovereignty of the United States, that for the alleged benefits of states' rights or the like. It was actually more to the point in defense of the alleged rights of foreign powers, chiefly those of the British Empire to corrupt the United States. And then he goes on. So I just, even though some people here may be familiar with these ideas, in terms of what LaRouche is talking about with energy flux density and the powers of labor and the productivity per capita, these things all are very actually simple, fundamental measurements on progress, on human progress. Now, who knows what the energy flux density, when LaRouche uses it, what that means? You don't count.
Man's power over fire in higher forms.
Yeah, basically it's a measurement of the amount of energy, whether it be fire or electricity or whatever, over a given area or volume over a period of time. And you can measure different, that's what this, I'm just going to show this thing because it's really neat. And I don't have to say anything because it's all pictures. This is what you're looking at is how much power you get out of each pound of these materials. So this is a lot of wood here. And per 1 pound of wood, you get 1.9 kilowatts. It's about a couple hours of your household energy. So for a pound of coal, it's almost double, 3.8 kilowatts. kilowatt hours, I think is what this is measured in. And then we move on to petroleum, goes up 6.4 kilowatts, or kilowatt hours per pound. And then you have this little itty bitty fission material, or whatever that may be, uranium, 18,900 kilowatts per pound. Woo! A lot more efficient. And then you get to fusion, your fusion fuel, 40 million kilowatts per pound. And then it goes back and it shows you the, you know. So obviously it's a huge difference if your economy is based on burning wood as opposed to petroleum and clearly fission and fusion. And this is, you can look at this historically, because it does develop over time, right? So this is the same parameters here, right? We have the wood, 1.9 kilowatts per pound, coal, petroleum, fusion, fission, fusion. And this is a span over time. So of course, a long period of time, basically the entire basis of economy was burning of wood. And then coal's introduced, and that's what these cones represent, right? So you have wood still being burned here, and then coal's begun to be introduced, and then you get to petroleum, and these are the increasing densities. Now the reason I have the Joe Farmer here, that's Joe Farmer. Now, so here's this Joe the Farmer 1 and Joe the Farmer 2. Or Joe the Farmer and Joe great-great-great-great-great-grandson, or something like that. Now here's the Joe the Farmer of, let's say, 400 years ago, 500 years ago, and he's absolutely no different in terms of his commitment, his passion, his hard-working ethics, etc., than Joe the Farmer of, let's say, today, or 50 years ago. No difference with, in fact, Joe the Farmer from 500 years ago could have been even a better person, you know, known more, etc. However, since he's operating in a coal-based or a wood-based economy, then what he's able to actually physically produce on a daily, hourly, weekly basis is going to be radically less than Joe great-great-great-great-great-grandson, right? And just, I mean, this is obvious stuff, right? So this is the wood-based economy, tilling of the soil. So obviously the amount of soil tilled over time, let's say a week, a day, or whatever, is radically smaller than this guy here, who's running one of these modern till machines. What they don't even turn the soil over anymore now when they plant. And it's the same thing with the harvesting, right? This guy is going to get a lot less done over a week doing this than the guy sitting here, which you can't even see in this machine.
And you got air conditioning and listen to
And they got air conditioning and they can listen to Bach. I don't know if they're doing that, but anyway. And then you can see this just in terms of real terms. This is, and we're just taking farming. You can look at all walks of life in this, right? And this is what LaRouche is saying. So the relative productive powers of labor is greater, right, as this energy flux density is at a different level, right, in a human society. This is just output per man hour. So I'm working on a farm, and this is how much I can put out over an hour in terms of actual. I mean, farming is great because there's no room for BS. You're producing, like, how many tomatoes did you produce? 1 or 100, you know? And what you see here is around the time of the late 1930s into the 40s and right after the post-war, you just see the amount of output per hour, per capita, it just goes through the ceiling. And this is because of petroleum. There's two things: the introduction of electricity, the rural electrification of FDR, where all the farms were electrified, and then the introduction of petroleum-based machinery into farming, right? But anyway, it's just a good example. And so this is what we want to do. This is what we're looking at. If you're at all a thinking human being, you're saying, gosh, you know, what's going to be how can we what's the next level that we're going to? What's the future that we're going to? You know, so we can we used to call it progress. Right? Now, obviously, under these oligarchical systems, these imperial systems, these slave systems, there is no ability by the average person, who may be a slave or whatever, or by the structure as a whole, right, to set into motion a process where you're having this continual progress. In this case, the Roman Empire, which is just a slave system. And furthermore, these oligarchical systems are nothing but parasitical. So what was the Roman Empire? Why did they have to keep expanding? Just because they wanted to have more slaves. Well, you can only do that to a certain point, and then the whole thing just rots out and collapses. So obviously that doesn't work, nor does the British Empire system, where you just systematically hold food from people, you starve them to death. Obviously these forms of political structures do not afford this kind of progress that we're looking to do. And so the great issue became at a certain point, I mean, obviously these are a little bit more advanced ideas that LaRouche developed in terms of his breakthroughs on the science of physical economy. But in some fashion it was clear at a certain point there's not going to be any more progress in mankind until some other form of social order and government was created. And this kind of all came to a crisis, and LaRouche goes through this more also, in 1431, right? Which was the satanic execution, and it was done in a deliberately satanic way, of Joan of Arc, carried out by the Church of Christians, right? And this so horrified the Christian world that people said, that's it, this has to be overthrown, this is too much, this has to change. And all of these people were contemporaries. It's Nicholas of Cusa, who was the founder of the idea of a sovereign nation state based on the consent of the governed, right? This was never even an idea before. This is Brunelleschi, who has made, between Brunelleschi and then 100 years later, Kepler, this is actually the basis of modern science. And again, this is a gloss, right? But it's in this period of what we call the Renaissance, right, when you get a complete shift. Now, and of course, as a lot of people here know, it was clear at a certain point to Cusa and his followers and the creators of the Renaissance that this was not going to happen in a aristocracy, oligarchical dominated Europe. That there's nowhere for you to go. You could create this kind of a political system. And so, of course, the project was, get a bunch of people over to North America. There's no oligarchs over there. We can create something completely different, right? And that was, again, some people are familiar with that here. The actual foundation of that was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And I just want to say a couple things about this in terms of John Winthrop. Because here, I'll just read you some of these things here. This is 1629. He's writing, I believe, to the Crown on, or actually, it's some kind of a public statement on the reasons for justifying going to New England and doing this, right? He says the following: "This land grows weary of her inhabitants, so as man, who is the most precious of all creatures, is here more vile and base than the earth we tread upon, and of less price among us than a horse or a sheep. Masters are forced by authority to entertain servants. All towns complain of the burden of the poor, though we have not taken up any necessary though we have taken up many unnecessary, yea, unlawful trades to maintain them." So we're dealing with the poor by, making them into prostitutes, and who knows what else. So it's very clear what he's saying here. This place is not affordable for human life, so we have to go to New England. And on what basis is the people that are going on this expedition to create this new form of government? What's the idea here? Principles are the following: to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end we must be knit together, in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of all superfluities for the supply of the other's necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. So that's pretty incredible. Right? You're doing something for other people's benefits. This is what you're always thinking about. You're always thinking about the community as a whole. Right? And I assure you, there's no form of government anywhere on the planet that is doing anything like that. Anyway, there's obviously a whole story in terms of the history that is involved here that creates the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It comes under attack from the British, from the Crown. To give you an idea that this is not just some... And this Winthrop, this is from the guy who actually created this and it brought this whole thing into being and brought the people over here, and, you know, et cetera. He just writes this at a certain point. If our parent be taken away from us, whereby we suppose we may claim interest in His Majesty's favor and protection, the common people here will conceive that His Majesty has cast them off, and that hereby they are freed from their allegiance and subjection, and thereupon will be ready to confederate themselves under a new government for their necessary safety and subsistence. So it's clear. We are going to uphold these standards. And just to go back, what the content of this is not abstract, right? They set into motion a whole process of bringing in the greatest levels of science and technology to develop this whole colony, right, into a very, very high standard of energy flux density and productivity per capita, et cetera. This is the Saugus Iron Works. Nothing like this had ever been done. Where it's kind of like a Manhattan Project, which produces everything in terms of what can be done with iron. And they had to go back to England. John Winthrop Jr. had to go back to England and get the people and the financing, et cetera, but they did do it. But this was always the idea. Anyway, this came under attack. The charter was revoked. The Anglo-Dutch, because that's really what it was. Remember, the Dutch took over the British Crown in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. That's William of Orange that LaRouche always talks about. And this is when the Massachusetts Bay Colony, in terms of any kind of idea of political independence, was crushed. Throughout this period, the inheritors of this project, which were the leaders of it, were Increase Mather here and Cotton Mather, the Mathers. So they were there. They were there in New England and Boston battling it out. Increase Mather. Anyway, I don't have time to go through a lot of this stuff. I actually want to focus for the moment on Cotton Mather, because he writes a very extensive document at a certain point, which is called Essays to Do Good. Has anybody ever heard of this? Essays to Do Good, yeah. And Benjamin Franklin said it was this work that was the defining work that he read that created what he was in his life. It was this Essays to Do Good. And I'll just read you one thing. It's a long work, there's a lot in it, but I'll just read you the very last, it's really the last paragraph. He says, I will conclude with a testimony which I will ever adhere to. It is this: were a man able to write in 7 languages, could he daily converse with the sweets of all the liberal sciences, to which the most accomplished men generally make pretensions, Were he to entertain himself with all ancient and modern history, and could he feast continually on the curiosities which all the different branches of learning may discover to him, even this, and much less the grosser delights of sense, would not afford the ravishing satisfaction which he might find in relieving the distresses of a poor miserable neighbor, in which he could find much more in doing any extensive service to the kingdom of our great Savior and in the world, or by his efforts to redress the miseries under which mankind is generally languishing. So that's his idea of ravishing satisfaction, is redressing the miseries under which mankind is generally languishing. And in this, the last whole section is about something that he calls reforming societies. Reforming society. And then he says, here's the idea of the reforming society is, okay, you're in your community or commonwealth or whatever, you get a bunch of people together that are concerned, and you meet every week or every 2 weeks, every month, and you look at the whole picture and say, okay, what do we have to do over the next week or 2 weeks to make the conditions of life better for people than they are now? What are we going to do? You plot this out, and that's how it's governed. And this is what later became the juntos of Benjamin Franklin. You know, these groups that he would organize in all the various different cities in the colonies. And that's what they would plot out to do. And of course, in Franklin's case, all these things is what he created. Vaccinations, the idea of public libraries, police protection, the idea of a public school, right? All these things that we take for granted as part of a free Republican society, you know, small r Republican. This was all done through this whole period, the American Philosophical Society, and then of course all the stuff on electricity. This was a big deal, because with the work that he did with the lightning rod, freed people from the terror and death, you know, of dying by getting hit by electricity. That was not some small affair. So continually you have, over the period of the 18th century, you know, from the time of the Mathers through Franklin, the place where we are now is progressing. It's progressing. Life is getting better in terms of the actual power of the individual over nature. Yeah.
So all this rays are creations of Benjamin Franklin?
Yeah. And his junto.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was not taught this in school.
Yeah, no, well, they don't teach much of anything in school. It's actually fascinating to look at all these things and how they all came about. But yeah, but especially the libraries. I mean, think about it, you know, the idea that you have a library, anybody, no matter who they are, can have access to all the knowledge and books. And there's no difference. You don't have to be Lord somebody, you know, to walk into the library and read Plato. We take it for granted, because, you know, but that's a revolution. That's a total revolution. Anyway, so all of this is going to reach a crisis point at a certain point, because after the creation of the Anglo-Dutch monarchy in 1688, there's fights in Britain, back and forth, back and forth. We almost create a situation where we recruit an heir to the throne, Queen Anne, which is what Leibniz is working on. That doesn't work. That's in the beginning of the 18th century. And then it just becomes increasingly in conflict with the interests of, because after, we have to realize what happened with the creation of the Anglo-Dutch monarchy is that you had essentially, the crown became nothing more than the British East India Company. It was Dutch banking. There's no government, right? It's that the empire is banking and our ability to loot. So, just say a couple things about this thing with Hamilton, because Hamilton comes completely out of this whole process. Franklin, who has all sorts of conspiracies all over the world, in Europe and in the Caribbean, he has operatives as part of his junta, as part of the conspiracy for the good, right? And one of them is named Reverend Hugh Knox, who's down in St. Croix in the Caribbean, who's a pastor, but he also has a huge library. And he's there obviously looking to educate and find. And this is what they would do. They would look to actually find, you know, talented minds that they could bring into the whole project. That's part of idea of the junto and the reforming societies, right? And they've run into this, 14, 15-year-old kid named Alexander Hamilton, and clearly recognized. And there's a lot of different stories on this, but it's very difficult to tell. One of them is that Hugh Knox actually moved in for a summer to the Hamilton residence because he just lived with his mother. And anyway, I won't get into all that. There's a whole story of divorce and this and that. But Knox moved into the residence with his whole library and worked with Hamilton on reading through all sorts of things. But anyway, you can see here, this is kind of what he would do. He's like 14 years old. Plutarch, Shakespeare, Milton, Plato, English poets, Greek philosophers. So this is obviously someone that has a ravishing satisfaction in the word of Cotton Mather for knowledge. Anyway, he gets himself in trouble down there because he at 14 years old he writes a whole pamphlet, 15 or whatever it is, attacking slavery. He absolutely despises slavery and the degradation it does to human beings. So here this kid writes a whole pamphlet. This causes a whole hubbub. So at a certain point, the Franklin Circle say, look, let's just get this guy into the continent. He's valuable, and he's sent to live at the home of the members of Franklin's Philosophical Society, the Boudinot family in New Jersey. And he's given private tutoring, and he studies. He goes to King College. And it's pretty clear that he, at a certain point, just develops a complete passion of creating this new revolutionary form of government that can ensure that we can redress the miseries under which mankind is generally languishing. Again, in the words of Mather. Now, I want to start on the Hamilton part of this with this. This is the first major political intervention. This guy's 18 years old, so keep that in mind, right? And this is actually written in 1774. It's called The Farmer Refuted. And what occurs is that you have a British operative who writes a whole pamphlet, and he calls himself the upstate farmer, Mr. Farmer, the farmer from upstate. And it's just a lie. He's just a British colonial operative. And the purpose of his pamphlet is to terrorize all the farmers, saying, if you stick with this American rebellion thing, you're going to be ruined. You're going to be cut off with everything. You'll be cut off with all your trade. You're going to starve and blah, 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 right? So Hamilton takes upon himself to write a pretty extensive pamphlet, which is then mass circulated, printed, etc., called The Farmer Refuted, right? And you begin to see, I want to read from sections, because you begin to see here how he's beginning to formulate, because he has to organize these people to be part of this revolutionary project, right? And, okay, I'm just going to read through this. It's just fun. It says, we are threatened with absolute slavery. It has been proved that resistance by means of petition would not be efficacious, and of course, that a restriction on our trade is the only peaceable method in our power to avoid the impending mischief. Those who affect to ridicule the resistance America might make to the military force of Great Britain and represent its humiliation as a matter to the most easily to be achieved, betray either a mind clouded by the most irrational prejudices or a total ignorance of human nature. However, it must be the wish of every honest man never to see a trial. Addressing the fears of an actual military confrontation with the empire. But, should we admit a possibility of a third course, as our pamphleteer, the farmer, supposes, that is the endeavoring to bring us to a compliance by putting a stop to our whole trade, right? So, we get in conflict with the British, trades get shut down, with the crown, blah, 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 right? He says, even this would not be so terrible as he pretends. We can live without trade of any kind. Food and clothing we have within ourselves. Our climate produces cotton, wool, flax, and hemp, which with proper cultivation would furnish us with summer apparel in abundance. The article of cotton indeed would do more. It would contribute to defend us from the inclemency of winter. We have sheep, which with due care in improving and increasing them would soon yield a sufficiency of wool. The large amount of skins we have among us would never let us want a warm and comfortable suit. It would be no unbecoming employment for our daughters to provide skills of their own country. The silkworm answers as well here as in any part of the world. Those hands which may be deprived of business by the cessation of commerce may be occupied in various kinds of manufactures and other internal improvements. The guy sitting around the counting house, whatever, working at the port, he's out of a job doing that. He can go learn how to work a machine. If, by the necessity of the thing, manufacture should once be established and take root among us, it will pave the way still more to the future grandeur and glory of America, and by lessening its need of external commerce, will render it still secure against the encroachments of tyranny. So it's pretty radical. See what he's saying? He's saying we don't need anything. We don't need any of their crap. We can create everything we want right here, including manufacturing. I assure you, nobody's saying this in 1774. The revolution's not even started yet. I mean, Lexington and Concord is 6 months away. Right? And this I love. Some people try to make you believe that we are disputing about the foolish trifle of 3 pence duty upon tea. They may as well tell you that black is white. Surely you can judge for yourselves. It is a dispute whether the Parliament of Great Britain shall make what laws and impose what taxes they please upon us or not. I say, is this a dispute about 3 pence duty upon tea? The man that affirms it is deserves to be laughed at. It is true, we are denying to pay the duty upon the tea, but it's not for the value of the thing itself. It's because we cannot submit to that without acknowledging the principle upon which it is founded. And that principle is a right to taxes in all cases whatsoever. But being ruined by taxes is not the worst you have to fear. What security would you have for your lives? How can any of you be sure you would have the free enjoyment of your religion long? Would you put your religion in the power of any set of men living? Remember, civil and religious liberty always go together. If the foundation of the one be sapped, the other will fall, of course. The farmer cries, that's the farmer being, person being refuted, tell me not of delegates, congresses, committees, mobs, riots, insurrections, associations, a plague on them all. Give me the steady, uniform, unbiased influence of the courts of justice. I have been happy under their protection, and I trust in God I shall be again. I say, quote, tell me not of the British Commons, lords, ministry, ministerial tools, placemen, pensioners, parasites. I scorn to let my life and property depend upon the pleasure of any of them. Give me the steady, uniform, unshaken security of constitutional freedom. What the hell is constitutional freedom? It's not give me liberty, give me that. He said this, and of course you see how he's formulating this. He already has it in his mind that this is where all of this is going to be going. Give me the steady, uniform, unshaken security of constitutional freedom. So that's in. Now, of course, I want to just point this out, just because this is a couple of years later, 76, but this is Lord Shelburne. And this is just a lot of fun because Lord Shelburne was the big opponent of military action against the colonies. Now, this is a big waste of money, especially after Saratoga in 1777. He was the big public leader in the British Parliament saying, pull all the troops out, this is a big waste. Now, what does that mean? He liked what we were doing here? No, right? He said, we'll crush these people. We'll wipe them out of existence. We'll do it through the power of our control over the commerce. And then he gets Smith to put this piece of crap out in 1776 called The Wealth of Nations, which is supposed to be the whole basis of free trade, laissez-faire, and blah, 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 blah. So it's important to know that that's what's going on, because already, remember, this is barely, the fighting part of the revolution has barely begun. Already, this is the battle lines that are being drawn, with Hamilton at, 18, 19 years old in the middle of it. Now, in 77, Hamilton then becomes the aide-de-camp to Washington. And this is quite important because an aide-de-camp to Washington, Hamilton is, of course, privy to all sorts of private discussions and deliberations. And I have to say that a large portion of what, especially Washington did, we don't know and we never will know. So you just live with it, okay? Deal with it, as they say, right? Because by nature, it had to be completely secretive in terms of the conspiracies that they were hatching. Hamilton was on the inside of that, and also Washington greatly respected the integrity and power of his mind and the ability also then to write. So a lot of these official documents from Washington to this, that, etc., were written by Hamilton, right? And so this is the beginning of a relationship between these two men, which actually created, as we'll see, the American constitutional system, the federal government of the United States, right? The guy on the right there is James Duane, who was the member of the Continental Congress, later the first free mayor of New York City. He was the first mayor after the Declaration of Independence, or after the British got thrown out. Anyway, and this is only a year later than this is in 1780, so the war is still raging. He writes his long letter to Duane. He says the Confederation, that is the current Articles of Confederation, is defective. It requires to be altered. It is neither fit for war nor peace. The idea of an uncontrollable sovereignty in each state over its internal police will defeat the powers given to Congress and make our union feeble and precarious. The Confederation gives the power of the purse too entirely to the state legislators. It should provide perpetual funds and the disposal of the Congress by land tax, etc., etc. Without revenues, a government can have no power. The power which holds the purse strings, absolutely must rule. This seems to be a medium which, without making Congress altogether independent, will tend to give reality to its authority. Anyway, that's just the beginning. What actually he goes through in this letter is his idea of a bank, right? Of a national bank under the authority of this constitutional freedom, government of constitutional freedom.
When was this?
1780. Nobody's talking about these things at all. I mean, nobody's talking about constitutional government and federal. Nobody, right? This is all completely being developed by Hamilton, and then obviously who knows the discussions he's having with all these other people. This is a letter to Duane, so he's probably in a dialogue with Duane and also, Washington, etc. Anyway, I want to get to this because this is this document here, these series. This is kind of like the definitive declaration of Hamilton on what the government of the United States ought to, has to, and what will become. And it's written in it's actually a series of like 6 pamphlets that are printed in papers. Again, the war is raging, so this is in the middle of Captain Hamilton running the artillery and all these military things. And it's called the Continentalist. The Continental Army, the Continentalists. And I'm going to read from a bunch of this stuff because it's really quite extraordinary. Because it's a real crisis. But you see, let me just read from it. He says, our whole system is in disorder, our currency depreciated, till in many places it will hardly obtain a circulation at all. Public credit is at its lowest ebb. Our army is deficient in numbers and unprovided with everything. The government, in its present condition, is unable to command the means to pay, clothe, or feed the troops. The enemy making an alarming progress in the southern states, lately in complete possession of 2 of them. We ought to blush to acknowledge that this is a true picture of our situation when we reflect that the enemy's whole force in the United States, including their American levies and late reinforcements, is little more than 14,000 effective men. And then he says that basically, if you look over the last 10 years or the last few years since this revolution started, we actually have more people. People are actually living better, right? In terms of, et cetera. So what's going on here? There's obviously a problem. He says nothing but a general disaffection of the people or mismanagement in their rulers can account for the figure that we make, and for the distresses and perplexities we experience contended against so small a force. He's got a point, How can 14,000, it doesn't make any sense. There's obviously another power here running things. He said the preceding numbers are chiefly intended to confirm an opinion already pretty generally received that it is necessary to augment the powers of the Confederation, the government. It may be pronounced with confidence that nothing short of the following articles can suffice. Number 1, the power of regulating trade, comprehending a right of granting bounties and premiums by way of encouragement, of imposing duties of every kind as well as for revenue and regulation, of appointing all officers of customs, laying embargoes in extraordinary emergencies. And then he goes on, number 2, a moderate levy tax throughout the United States, on specific per pound, per acre of farms and stuff. What he calls a capitation tax, which is which is basically like an income tax, as far as I can tell. The disposal of all unlocated land for the benefit of the United States. Number 5, a certain proportion of the product of all mines discovered or to be discovered. 6, the appointment of all land, as well as naval officers of every rank. He says the first 3 of these articles are of immediate necessity. The last 3 would be of great present, but of much greater future utility. The whole combined would give solidity and permanency of the union. So number 1 is the power of regulating trade. And then these various taxes. He says, the great defect of this confederation is that it gives the United States no property at all, or in other words, no revenue, nor means of acquiring it, inherent in themselves and independent on the temporary pleasure of the different members. And power without revenue in political society is a name. While Congress continue altogether dependent on the occasional grants of the several states for the means of defraying the expenses of the federal government, it can neither have dignity, vigor, nor credit. Credit supposes specific and permanent funds for the punctual payment of interest, with a moral certainty of the final redemption of the principal. The vesting Congress with the power of regulating trade ought to have been a principal object of the Confederation for a variety of reasons. It is as necessary for the purpose of commerce as of revenue. Well, this is not here, this is it. There are some who maintain that trade will regulate itself and is not to be benefited by the encouragements of restraints or of government. Such persons will imagine that there is no need of a common directing power. This is one of those wild speculative paradoxes which have grown into credit among us, contrary to the uniform practice and sense of the most enlightened nations. Contradicted by the numerous institutions and laws that exist everywhere for the benefit of trade, by the pains taken to cultivate particular branches and to discourage others, by the known advantages derived from those measures, and by the palpable evils that would attend their discontinuance, it must be rejected by every man acquainted with commercial history. Commerce, like other things, has its fixed principles according to which it must be regulated. To preserve the balance of trade in favor of a nation ought to be the leading aim of its policy. Right? But that's not an obvious point. To preserve the balance of trade in favor of a nation ought to be the leading aim of its policy. So that has to be the power that your sovereign government has above anything else. The avarice of individuals may frequently find its account in pursuing channels of traffic prejudicial to that balance, to which the government may be able to oppose effectual impediments. There may, on the other hand, be the possibility of opening new sources, which, though accompanied with great difficulties in the commencement, would, in the event, amply reward the trouble and expense of bringing them to perfection. The undertaking may often exceed the influence and capitals of individuals, and may require no small assistance, as well from the revenue as from the authority of the state. And then the last two paragraphs of this whole series from the last pamphlet. There is something noble and magnificent in the perspective of a great federal republic, closely linked in the pursuit of the common interest, tranquil and prosperous at home, respectable abroad. But there is something proportionably diminutive and contemptible in the prospect of a number of petty states, with the appearance only of union, jarring, jealous, perverse, without any determined direction, fluctuating and unhappy at home, weak and insignificant by the dissensions in the eyes of other nations. Happy America, if those to whom thou hast entrusted the guardianship of thy infancy know how to provide for thy future repose, but miserable and undone if their negligence or ignorance permits the spirit of discourse to erect her banner on the ruins of thy tranquility. So, again, this is 1781, right? So again, the war's not over yet. So I want to say, so anyway, so you see a whole process in terms of the specifics of Hamilton from, whatever, the time he's 17, 16 years old, and then his collaboration with Washington. And also a key person that's very critical of this is, of course, Benjamin Franklin, who's still around designing all this, although he's, of course, in the beginning of the Revolution, he's out of the country because he has to secure the international allegiances to make this effective. Anybody ever seen this painting before? You've seen it because you've probably seen it where it's in the House, isn't it?
Where? You mean in
the House of Representatives.
Oh, I've never seen it.
Oh, you haven't seen it? Yeah. That's what I read. Anyway. So this is a painting that was actually done by, what's this guy's name? Howard Chandler Christie of the Constitutional Convention.
Yeah, I believe it's in Philadelphia also.
Oh, maybe? Okay. Yeah. Anyway, so
There it is.
so all of this whole process culminates with basically what I like about the painting is that it's like really accurate in terms of who's doing what. Because the center of the painting is here, which is Franklin and Hamilton. Right? So these are the conspirators to create this constitutional freedom, this new form of government. And then, of course, you have Washington, who's the chairman of the convention. And then, what he does is he paints these guys here. These are the only people looking at you, right? Here and here. And these are the Morrises from Pennsylvania. Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution, Gouverneur Morris, part of the Pennsylvania. And then off in the side here, kind of looking, his eyes are glazing over it, that is Madison. Because, of course, everybody says, "Oh, Madison, he's the creator of the Constitution." Why? Because in 1770, whatever the hell they wrote a Virginia Constitution, which is the bicameral system. It's just a formal part of it. It's good, it's fine, but that's not what the federal constitutional system is, right? It's a law empowering a government with the consent of the government to implement and institutionalize this principle of progress. And then have that spread through the rest of the world. So that you can eliminate the power of oligarchy and slavery as an institution from the planet. That's the constitutional, that's what the Constitution is, right? And then it's all sorts of fight. And the other thing I want to just say about this, because people that say, yes, I know, the Constitutional Convention, yes, and this was discussed, and that's what it is. They're full of shit. Nobody knows what was discussed. The whole point about it is that this is the secretary, William Jackson, who was the recording secretary, right? You know, his major job was to enforce the secrecy oath of the convention. This was done under absolute secrecy. Nobody, it was like being in a jury, you know? You couldn't talk about it, you couldn't write about it, you couldn't publish anything about it. What's that?
Like being sequestered.
Yeah, basically. And it's for obvious reasons. Because you don't want to, because there's all sorts of internal fights going on, this thing among the states and this and that, et cetera, right? So we have no idea what, I mean, it would have been wonderful to see, you know, Hamilton getting up and giving these impassioned speeches that we'll never know, you know, because I'm sure he did. And you can't trust Madison's notes because, you know, he's not going to highlight that necessarily, and that's released after his death. You know, that's what he refers to as the minutes, Madison's minutes, because he took all these extensive notes. But we do know a couple fights that really broke out, and one, of course, was this issue of the necessary and proper clause, which is absolutely critical, right? And it's done with, because seeing everything that Hamilton is saying here about the power of the government to be able to regulate commerce, the national bank, etc. You have Article 1, Section 8, people know this, right, where all the powers of Congress are delineated. You know, power to levy, whole list of them. Lay and collect taxes, duties, borrow, commerce, coin money, right? It goes on and on, and it's very long. So you do this, declare war, define blah, blah, blah. It's all very specific things. And then the last one is, oh, and by the way, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution of the government of the United States in any department or officer thereof. Right? So, to make all and any laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution. So that's pretty open, and there was a big fight over that. But of course, Hamilton and Frank and company, they know why they're putting these things in there. Because we have to have the ability to create these institutions, you know, like the National Bank, et cetera, that are actually going to promote the general welfare and create an unending principle of progress for the country. And there's other stuff like that. You know, but in any case, again, this issue of the Bill of Rights, so they draft the whole Constitution, it's all written, everybody's about to go home. And then, you know, Edmund Randolph from Virginia says, I'm leaving, I'm going home, I'm not voting. Because we have to have a delineated Bill of Rights of how we're going to be protected, you know. And Washington and Hamilton are like, that's like implicit in the Declaration of Independence, and it almost takes away the force of what the intention of this constitutional form of government is. So he goes home, he won't come back, takes his toys and go home, you know. And so they have to say, okay, we'll put in the first 10 minutes, that's fine, well, we don't care, you know. So they do. And here's another funny thing, to give you an idea of the difference between, I didn't read from this, but at a certain point, you know, when the Constitution be ratified and Hamilton writes the Federalist Papers to promote it, well, actually, I'll just find it. Just read the very first Federalist paper. You can read this. It says, it would be happy. So he's saying the idea. This idea will add inducements of philanthropy to those of patriotism, heighten the solicitude which all considerate and good men must feel for the event. This is if we ratify the Constitution. Happy will it be if our choice should be directed by a judicious estimate of our true interests, unperplexed and unbiased by considerations not connected with the public good. Right? Like, you know, I want my power in my state. What about my state? You know, which is of course all this stuff. And Madison's a perfect example. I mean, this guy is just such a whore. He is such a whore. I mean, he's a man of principle. He's obviously, you know, ingenious. But here the guy is totally with Hamilton and Franklin, et cetera, on this question of even the Bill of Rights, for example. That's a good one. He opposed it also. But then all of a sudden, so they leave the convention, and then he goes back, and then I have to be elected in Virginia to the Congress, and everybody's demanding this. So he completely just changed 180 degrees. And this is what Madison is the rest of his entire life, right? And I just want to say a couple things about this, because the way all of this came into being, in terms of the actual honing of the government, is, you know, go to this slide. Okay, so this is the first cabinet. So Washington becomes the president, Henry Knox, Secretary of War, Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, Jefferson, Secretary of State, Randolph, Attorney General. Okay? And the entire first term, in this Washington first term, you know, from 1789 to 1793, 94, is when the government, this federal government, this constitutional government, is actually honed and created. And it's all done with a conspiracy, if you will, between Washington, Franklin, who's very much part of this. Of course, he's dead at a certain point. He was a very critical part of the Constitution. And Hamilton. Just the way that they probably worked together during the war as general and, you know, commander-in-chief and aide-de-camp. So in this first administration, that's exactly how they're working. And so what Hamilton does is he puts forth these series of reports on using this, you know, conception of this federal government to promote the general welfare, which is what the whole idea of a constitutional, he called it earlier, constitutional freedom is. And puts forth these report on public credit, the report on creating a national bank, the opinion on the Constitution of the National Bank, the report on the subject of manufacturers. And of course, we don't have time to go through any of this in terms of detail, but I want to just focus on one thing, which is the opinion on the constitutionality of a national bank. Because what occurs is that every step of the way, you have Jefferson, to a different degree, Randolph, and then Madison in the Congress. They are just fighting Hamilton on everything. Everything. And it really, in Madison, it's just like, they actually, there's a whole paper that's created, newspaper, to attack Washington. And this stuff is just so violent. If people are interested in it, can get this book. This is definitely worth reading. You don't have to read the whole 900 pages. You can just skip to the George Washington administration part, right, and just read through this. This is Ron Chernow's Washington Alive, came out a few years ago. As he goes through this, it's very, very clear that there's just a constant effort to undermine everything that Hamilton is doing. And then there's these vile attacks on Washington, just like really nasty, like the kind of stuff we used to see in the press about LaRouche. It's read just like that. Yeah, it's just read just like that. It's incredible.
Who's behind that?
It's the British.
I wonder.
Anyway, so what happens is that ultimately, on this question of the national bank, so these bills all pass the Congress because there's bills associated with all these reports, enabling this, enabling that. So this is all done boom, 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 boom over a year, right? Enabling, so all these, and at a certain point, the national bank, this is too much for some of the opponents, and so even though it goes to the floor, and it's about to be voted on, and everybody in the administration is supposed to be, on the same page. Jefferson, Randolph, and but mainly Jefferson and Randolph, they go to Washington and say, we can't do it, this is unconstitutional. This bank is unconstitutional, forget about it. And the reason that they cite, in terms of Jefferson, he says, well, there's nothing in the Constitution. I read through these articles of, the powers of Congress. It doesn't say you can create a corporation, right?
Yeah.
And so the issue. So of course, in Hamilton, ultimately, and he goes through all the records. The main point he makes is, because then one of them, I think it was Randolph, goes this whole thing about corporations, and they could be they can take over. And Hamilton says, what is this? I mean, you're just divorcing the reality and the intent. I have it right here. The intention of what we're doing, and turning this into words, because you have to look at what end is it that we're doing this toward what end. And the thing that he says is that I'll just read it. It appears to the Secretary of the Treasury, this is Hamilton talking about himself, that this general principle is inherent in the very definition of government and essential to every step to progress to be made by that of the United States, namely, that every power invested in a government is in its nature sovereign and includes by the force of term a right to employ all the means requisite and fairly applicable to the attainment of the ends of such power, and which are not precluded by restrictions and exceptions specified in the Constitution, or not immoral, or not contrary to the essential ends of political society. And then later on, because then Jefferson says, well, you have to prove this is totally necessary, and Hamilton says, no, and then he quotes from his own, I believe that he wrote it, but from the necessary and proper clause, saying, no, this is necessary and proper for the further development of the powers of the Constitution on behalf of. Remember, it's we the people of the United States, right? This is not, it's not, we the bureaucrats that are part of the big bad federal government hereby ordained. That's not what it is. It's we the people say we are authorizing a government consented by us to have the power toward the end, these ends, promote the general welfare, what the preamble says, and that's very specifically to promote the general welfare. And the entire time, in terms of what Hamilton, Franklin, Washington were conspiring to do, was toward the end of this idea of the increasing, as we know today, energy flux density, where you could guarantee a form of government that would consistently be able to promote the necessary policies, where you could move from the wood base to the coal base to the nuclear to the et cetera. And there's very specific things. We're not going through that today, right? But one thing that people have in here, if you really want to kind of know the ins and outs of the Hamilton credit system, you can go back to your Wesser report. It's also available on the website, and just read this whole extensive section by Michael Kirsch on Alexander Hamilton's national banking system of public credit. Because we're not even getting into that, right? In terms of the, how this whole credit system came into being, this whole issue of the, the turning of the debt, the assumption of the state debt into then a basis to create currency and then credit, right? This is what he did. So this, again, this is stuff that people should know, and you can review it in detail in that section of this report. But the point is that was the issue. And as LaRouche has identified in this paper and the previous ones and the latest one that is not yet published, it should be the next DIR, there's a handful. You can count them on one hand, less than one hand, the actual presidents that had any inkling of this as the federal constitutional system, of exercising this power for the good, for the open-ended development of mankind. And that understood these principles that were then hammered out over that 4 to 5 year period in the first administration of George Washington, by Hamilton, etc., in terms of the power of credit, regulation of trade, etc. John Quincy Adams, Lincoln, and if you look at every one of these, in some fashion, they revived this, not necessarily with the national bank. In the case of Lincoln, it was the idea of understanding the power of the government to create credit, which could then be invested, to develop the nation or build up the war economy, whatever, with the greenbacks. FDR, the same thing, all the stuff with the New Deal. Work Progress Administration and WPA, PWA, all these things were corporations. And of course, and FDR was as these people that saw Tony Chaikin's presentation, was a pretty thorough student of Hamilton. Kennedy was simply following the footsteps of FDR, right? So you can see if,
Who was that in the upper left-hand corner?
John Quincy Adams, who kept this, who basically, remember, you have the destruction of the National Bank with Jackson, Andrew Jackson, here, Andrew Jackson.
The man who destroyed the U.S.
Yeah. So he tore down the National Bank, took all the money, gave it away to all his friends. Right? And really it was John Quincy Adams in the later part of the Monroe administration, that when he was Secretary of State, that basically, and then what he did after that, in this whole period where you had the states' rights thing being upbuilt more and more and more and more, he saved the United States and created the basis and was the mentor of Lincoln. And without what he had done, so these are all individual men. But you can imagine if you had a movement of people in the United States that had, when they're saying, I'm going to put my life on the line for the Constitution, if they had any inkling at all what this meant, we'd be in a completely different situation. And I submit with about 30 plus years, 40 years of our organizing, we are in a situation where we're beginning to see that. And we've all seen this and heard reports of the level of understanding, discussion of people that become involved now with what we're doing, with Keisha's campaign, is at a much different level than we've ever seen it, and Americans' ability to assimilate these ideas. So, anyway, so that's just scratching the surface. Yes.
John Quincy was after Andy Jackson?
Well, it's contemporary.
Was it contemporary? Well, was in terms of
No,
president?
he was president beforehand.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
Okay.
But his whole career went to 18, when he died, 18, what is it?
Oh,
54.
so,
Yeah, sounds right.
So
he said in his own autobiography, he said,
Yeah.
the greatest years of my life was the last years when I was in the Congress. Thwarting these bastards every step of the way, and that's what he did. So that's the period I'm kind of referring to, not just as president, but also when he was in the Congress.
I have a question about one of the presidents you mentioned earlier, President John Adams.
John Adams.
How was he not thinking of Constitution?
Well,
What did he do?
I don't know a lot about. All I could tell you is that I couldn't answer that competently, because I often had the same question. But one thing I do know is at a certain point, and someone else here may know the answer to that. He became just a bitter opponent of Hamilton. He just despised Hamilton.
Wow.
So there was some corrupt influence at a certain point on him. And that's generally what you find, because the way LaRouche has been formulating it about these people like Adams and Jefferson, he said, just petty, stupid, disgusting corruption. That's kind of the way he's characterizing it. He doesn't say, traitor, Jefferson was a traitor.
So that was nitpicking.
So in some fashion, there's some, and that's why I wanted to emphasize this idea of Hamilton's opening statement of the Federalist Papers. He said, we'll be very happy if we can direct this, right, with a judicious estimate of our true interest, not perplexed and unbiased by considerations not connected with the public good. Because at a certain point, the corruption is these people at some point get taken over by some sectarian interest. It's the case of Randall or Madison having to get reelected to the Congress in Virginia, and there's tremendous pressure because Virginia is this plantation system, slave plantation system. So in some fashion, and I'm sure there's people that would know the answer, somehow that had to have happened with Adams. Because the way how you could become such a bitter, opponent of Hamilton, I mean, really vicious stuff. So I don't know the particular thing that.
Lynn was referring to Adams having some interest in the fishing rights.
Fishing rights.
Okay, that's.
In New England,
See, I knew somebody would know.
Yeah.
And he made some kind of a deal with the British over fishing rights.
Yeah, there you go.
Canadian fishing rights.
Right.
Something like that, but it had something to do with particular interests in New England states versus
Right. Okay,
the rest of the nation.
Okay, good.
So
there you go.
Lynn referred to that.
So that always that's what the states' right thing. So if you don't understand the big picture, and you gotta think back again at these little quotes from Winthrop. In terms of, we're constantly thinking of the benefit of the whole, right? Of the whole, in this case, the whole nation. And if you're not thinking of that, and also of why we're empowering this constitutional form of government, to what end, then all of this crap comes in. Because this was a revolution in the idea of the design of a government, in terms of granting it these powers. But I think you'll find that in every single case, I'm sure. And that's what people get so disgusted. Isn't that what people get so disgusted by politics?
Yeah.
Is that kind of crap? It's what always comes up, Well, it's like these Democrats, well, you're right, but I can't go against my party.
Yeah, it's like eating each other.
What?
It's like eating each other.
I think it was Franklin that said one time, somebody who was arguing about taxes, he said something to the effect of, if the government functions in the way we propose, people would be happy to pay taxes.
Yeah. Hamilton said something like that.
Because
also.
you're investing in the future.
Actually, I think Hamilton said that.
Yeah.
I ran across that. Yeah. In fact, I was just looking at that. I don't remember where exactly. But yeah. Yeah, because this is my duty as a citizen. And of course, if you have this kind of government, actually, where the principle is progress. But it's important to reflect on this because, again, there's all these people out there saying Constitution, and ultimately, whether they know it or not, what they're referring to in terms of their understanding of it is this corruption. Because it always comes down to, my rights. And of course, the great irony is the more you focus on your rights, your individual rights, then the more quickly you lose them. And inversion of that is the more that you're thinking of the benefit of the other, the greater chance you have to secure your own rights. Because so the states' right thing is just a complete fraud. It's the right of the state to be run by a foreign power, and then they get destroyed too.
Anti-Westphalian principle.
Yeah, right, exactly. Which is where that comes from. Yeah, that's right. And it comes directly from it because that's that's Treaty of Westphalia. That's 16. Actually, the Winthrop was before the treaty was. But it's part of the spirit that created that. So that quote I read is actually from that's while the war, the 100 Years' War is still raging. The 30 Years' War.
This individual state things never worked.
No.
In the maritime field, we had a case It's a classic case of a guy who has a ship that was going from New York to New Jersey, and they didn't want to recognize his license because it was a New York license. You see? And at that point, that's when they said the licenses would be issued by the Lighthouse Service or something,
Yeah,
you know, and, which later became the United States Coast Guard.
yeah, right, yeah.
Because,
Wasn't that part of that,
in other words,
the Marshall,
all,
the one that-
all
the
licensed
Marshall
officers
case?
would be
the one that-
federally
Yeah, but
licensed.
in terms of that or the?
The commerce, the
National
whole idea
Bank?
of commerce. No,
Because
the Supreme
state-
Court ruled
When I
on
said
it.
that, when I
Yeah.
said.
Well, I actually wanted to mention that because, I mean, once you have this decision, you know, the way this worked with the constitutionality of the National Bank is that Washington said, okay, you guys oppose this, so you give me your written arguments against this, and I'll look at them. And then he deliberately let Hamilton have the last say, so he read them and then gave them all to Hamilton. So Hamilton could read them all and then formulate his ideas of the constitutionality of the National Bank. And that's how it passed the Congress. And then what I was going to mention was the Maryland versus McCulloch, which was the 1819 Supreme Court Marshall Court decision that upheld the National Bank. And that is the constitutional law. That's never been overturned. That's never even been challenged.